And as they say, sometimes you save the best for the last. But I stand corrected because the best is yet to come. The best is tomorrow when our research students are going to present their research all day long. But this final session for today is a special one because this is a roundtable. And we have titled it as Cold War 2.0. We talked about various aspects of Cold War in the last 2 days. Its cultures, its representation, its politics. But we haven't really looked ahead of what Cold War 2.0 is like, or whether it does exist, or what are its characteristics. And Cold War as a concept itself, as we know, is a very problematic one because in large part of the world, it was not cold, it was very hot. Something like 20 million people died in what was called the Third World in Cold War-related conflicts. So that's another dimension to this debate. But in the time we have for this roundtable, we want to look ahead and see if there are any contours emerging of a new Cold War or whether the concept itself is valid. To do this, I'm joined with three very distinguished guests. Two of them are joining from the United States, so it's morning from them. And the third one is from Singapore, so it's the same time zone as us in Hong Kong. I'm Daya Thussu. I'm a professor of international communication here. And it's my great privilege to moderate this session. So this is not a normal kind of presentation-based panel. It's much more of a conversation, and we want to keep it as informal as possible. That's not to say we want to compromise on quality or the substance. I'm joined in this discussion by three very important people. Ian Johnson, who is the Senior Fellow for China Studies at Council on Foreign Relations, formerly of the New York Times, has been in China for many, many years, knows it very well. So we'll get a very interesting perspective, both from the policy side, but also as a commentator and journalist and author who knows China very well. We have Maria Repnikova, who is assistant professor in global communication at Georgia State University. She's a specialist on Chinese political communication, has published extensively, notably her book, Media Politics in China, which published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, is a seminal text. And we'll hear from her about what she thinks about the new Cold War and also especially about Chinese soft power projects. Last but not least, I'm very pleased to introduce Kanti Bajpai, who is Wilmer Professor of Asian Studies and Director of the Center on Asia and Globalization at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. With Professor Bajpai, I share one little thing that we were same university in Delhi, which gets a very bad name currently in India for political reasons. He was also a professor there at Jawaharlal Nehru University, but he's also been at Oxford and various other international institutions. He's a frequent commentator, public intellectual, has a little column in a newspaper in India. And most recently, he's published what has been received as a very important book among policy people and commentators on India-China relations. It's called India versus China, Why They Are Not Friends. And you can see that book behind Professor Bajpai. So thank you all three for joining us. What I thought I will do to make it more interesting and not particularly heavy is to ask each one of you to speak very briefly about a few questions I want to raise. First question is Cold War 2.0 already underway? When you look at the cover pages of Time magazine, for instance, recently, and foreign Foreign Affairs Journal, the latest issue has, America's Cold Wars as the cover story, and various other both policy and elite journalism publications. So is Cold War 2.0 already underway? That's question number one. How is it different from the original Cold War? That's question number two. And the third question is something we have really referred to quite a lot in the last 2 days, is often this is projected as a bipolar conflict. The first Cold Wars were also seen as a conflict between Soviet Union and the United States, and this one is seen as a fight between between Beijing and Washington. It ignores other power centers, for example, European Union, for example, Russia, Brazil, India, and this in a multi-center world. How can we use this bipolar system to analyze what's happening in the world? So these three questions, and I would request Ian to speak first, because Ian's country is party to the current Cold War. Ian, please.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And just to make a small correction, I'm actually in Berlin right now, which perhaps makes it even. No. It makes it perhaps even more fitting to talk about the Cold War.
Yes, exactly.
This is sort of the capital of the Cold War, of the old Cold War at least. And I think, when we use the word Cold War, of course, any historical comparison is problematic, and we can always shoot it down because no two events in history are ever exactly the same. So, there are many reasons to find that wrong. I mean, one is that there was, I guess the biggest difference that I would see is that there was much more of a hard power confrontation, even though you could argue that there is a sort of hard power confrontation emerging in the Taiwan Straits or around Taiwan, and there are clashes between China and India on the border. But compared to the hundreds of thousands of troops and tanks that were amassed in Europe on either side of the Iron Curtain, and as you put it very importantly, that the Cold War from World War II until whatever the end of the 80s, however you want to define it, involved many hot wars and proxy wars and that killed millions of people. We aren't there yet, so fortunately. But there are many similarities in the sense of there being an ideological battle. In a globalized world, I don't think you're going to have exactly the same situation. The Soviet Union and the United States, for example, did not have integrated economies, and we have that, of course, between China and the United States. So there's that difference. And I thought the EU came out with a position paper in early 2019, which was essentially adopted by the Biden administration for how they viewed China. And this was picking up on something that was actually started by a German Federation of Trade that also was trying to look at relations with China. And they saw a three-pronged view of China, at least from Western countries. One would be that it's an ideological rival. So there is a hard ideological rivalry between these two. They are two incompatible systems. However, the two countries or systems are also economic competitors. And thirdly, they can also be partners or must be partners to solve certain issues such as globalization, global warming, for example, and climate change. So rivals, competitors, and partners, and keeping this paradoxical, seemingly contradictory idea in balance is, I think, a real challenge. I think there's a tendency in the United States to look at China as the next Soviet Union. I mean, some people have been doing this since the 1990s, but it really came up much more obviously under the Trump administration, and especially in last year, in the year 2020, when they carried out a series of almost kamikaze acts to isolate or try to isolate China in some way, closing a consulate, cutting off academic exchange programs like the Fulbright, cutting off the Peace Corps project, kicking out Chinese journalists, all of which had a predictable effect from the Chinese side, and pushing, and then of course the tariffs that started, the trade tariffs that started earlier than that. And I think we can see there is a consensus in China, in the United States, in Washington at least, to view China, perhaps not everybody views it as exactly a rival like the Soviet Union, but it's notable to me that the Biden administration has not reversed many of these policies. When the trade representative Catherine Tai gave her presentation a month ago, she said essentially, yeah, we're going to keep these tariffs in place, even though every study shows that it's American consumers who pay for it, and it really isn't hurting China. I think out of ideological grounds, they almost cannot withdraw from that position for fear of looking weak. And the same thing with the consulates. There's absolutely no reason. It's much more counterproductive for the United States to lose a consulate in China than for China to lose a consulate, say, in the United States. But there's been no real effort at a broad based effort to re-engage with China and to come up with some sort of modus vivendi. And I think on the Chinese side too, we see China viewing the world in very apocalyptic terms. The communique that was issued yesterday at the end of the six-party plenum had a striking phrase early in that communique where it says that the external environment has grown increasingly complex and grave. And one of these reasons was the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, which everybody can understand. But they talked about worldwide changes of a scale unseen in a century. And I think this probably has to do with China's perception that the external environment has become much more hostile towards China. And I would say arguably perhaps because of China's own actions. But so I think that leaders in both countries see this as a Cold War that's unfolding, and they seem almost paralyzed because of domestic political concerns. I think in Washington, everything is looking at next year's midterm elections. Everybody's afraid of doing anything such as changing China policy because this could hurt those prospects. And in China, there's almost a sense of paralysis waiting for the 20th Party Congress next year when Xi Jinping will be almost certainly reappointed to a third term. So both countries are hindered by these domestic concerns that make it hard to change this dynamic. Anyway, with that, those ideas, toss them out there, and we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's a good start. Maria, do you want to go next?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it was really interesting to listen to Ian's remarks, and I'm really delighted to be part of this panel early in the morning here from Atlanta. So my comments will focus a little bit more on the ideological side of the competition, because something that I'm researching for the past 3 years is related to Chinese global soft power, but specifically I'm looking at the global South. So my research is focused on Africa, and I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia looking at how this competition plays out on the ground. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the global South perspective. But first of all, to the question of, is this the new Cold War? I think everybody on this panel, and I think most China and US, watchers or analysts would agree that there's intensified rivalry on all fronts, from military to economic to ideological domains as well. So I think the intensified rivalry is obviously uncontested, but whether or not Cold War is a useful concept or useful trope, I think that's something that I would like to question. How helpful is this framing? So I think in some ways it obscures and oversimplifies the nature of contemporary US-China competition, and also diminishes the agency of other actors that shape and negotiate this relationship. This concept, I think, diminishes the agency of other actors I wanted to talk about here. So looking at this through the lens of kind of competition for values, contestation for values and ideology, and Ian mentioned that there's this heightened ideological contest, but I want to kind of highlight how in some ways maybe it's a little different from what we saw during the original Cold War. So unlike the original Cold War, when there was a relatively explicit, I think, ideological competition fueling the battle between the two superpowers, I think in the current moment, the competition is somewhat more, maybe more complex, more ambiguous when it comes to actual values or global visions. So the narrative of democracy versus autocracy has been popularized in some parts of the policy establishment in Washington, also in Europe. At a recent UN address, President Biden directly argued against the potential takeover of what he called authoritarianism and stressed that, quote, democracy remains the best tool to unleash human potential. But in practice, we see less, I think, of a competition for ideologically opposed political systems when we look at the actual practice, and more so different approaches of practicing and communicating soft power. So I think the US commitment, can be that on emphasizing values and ideals of liberal democracy is a superior system, as illustrated in the example of Biden's speech, but many, many other speeches as well. But China focuses less on the superiority of its political system, the way it communicates it outwards. It's not on promoting authoritarianism, at least not explicitly or directly, but more so positioning itself as kind of a gateway for economic empowerment and shared prosperity. That's how it communicates its soft power. And what we see is kind of a more ideation approach of the United States versus a more pragmatic approach of China. Something I also observe in routine practices of diplomacy, especially in Africa. Chinese diplomatic engagement tends to emphasize access to resources and material rewards and de-emphasize ideological values. If anything, Chinese training materials of elites from Global South that I've analyzed, they highlight the importance of following one's own path rather than adopting a model from others. So in some sense, they're de-emphasizing ideological values and the value of its own political system. Of course, for domestic audiences, they communicate very different messages. I think secondly, in the realm of soft power, just like in other sectors, there's also much mutual learning and interdependency. For instance, the very concept of soft power has traveled from the US to China and has been readapted, reinvented by Chinese scholars and policymakers. Some of the materials and ideas used in Chinese trainings also originate from the US. And presenting and explaining its political system, also Chinese materials, Chinese lectures often borrow on the language of democracy to highlight the participatory nature of the Chinese political system, as opposed to kind of praising or arguing in favor of autocracy or adopting an autocratic authoritarian political system. On the US side, the recent focus on infrastructure in many ways also echoes the BRI initiative in China. And third, I think, whereas in the original Cold War, we saw many countries, especially in the Global South, aligning with one or the other major superpower, at times, of course, out of pragmatic kind of necessity, but also in some cases forming deep ideological attachments. And I think in the case of contemporary competition, most studies show that countries in the Global South, but also major emerging powers that Daya mentioned at the beginning, including Russia, EU, India, Australia, they don't necessarily welcome an exclusive alignment with China or the US. So in my research in Africa, I find that officials, but also lay citizens, they skillfully negotiate the offerings from both sides. It is plausible to at once embrace democratic promotion assistance or to deploy the language of diplomatic solidarity to get something from the United States, as well as to continue to receive China's economic aid, assistance, investments, opportunities for studies, and so forth. So in many cases, when we look at the receiving end of this battle, of this kind of US-China competition, Chinese and US offerings are actually seen as complementary rather than completely oppositional. And other emerging powers like Turkey and Russia and India are really quite welcomed in this competition arena as well, as it allows for more space, more leverage to negotiate to secure preferred outcomes. So in Africa, we see very much not only just the US and China, but also especially India in the education sector, but Turkey in the financial investment sector, infrastructure, and Russia starting to also make some pledges and some appearances in some African contexts. So I think to conclude, I think it's important to recognize rivalry, but when we study it as scholars and observers, I think it's also more timely to come up with new concepts and frameworks than to use the same Cold War kind of analogy as a blanket phrase for all these contested activities. If we engage more deeply with narratives and practices of the US and Chinese diplomacy, how it actually works on the ground, as well as the reactions to them in different global contexts, I think we find that maybe more ambiguous competition in the realm of values and more hesitancy by other countries to align with one side or the other. We also see more interest in other emerging powers to assert their position and mitigate this asymmetry. Not everybody wants to align with these two camps. In fact, I think most don't. So if we step aside from the Cold War and dive into these diverse perspectives and complex realities, I think we'll see a different picture. And that's the task that I think should occupy scholars and observers for the time being, for the years to come. So I propose looking at other explanations, but using maybe Cold War analogy as starting point, but not necessarily as a blanket statement for everything that's happening on the ground. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Kanti.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm fairly comfortable with the Cold War analogy. As Ian said, no two things are exactly the same, but the issue really is whether this trope or analogy is a useful one. And I think Maria makes the point that at least it's a good starting point. And so I'd go at least that far in saying it's a starting point, but probably I'd go a bit further. Just 5 or 6 very quick points. I mean, I think first of all, you frame the question of whether the Cold War is underway. I mean, I agree with Ian that it was probably underway by the late 1990s, and certainly Bush term 1. I remember Condi Rice coming in and writing a piece in foreign policy in maybe 2000 or so, which already signaled the worry about China. And sitting in India, I mean, the discussions that began almost immediately with India and the valuation of India at that time, and then the subsequent India-US nuclear deal was certainly seen against the backdrop of an emerging United States rivalry with China. So, I mean, I think we've been in this Cold War, proto-Cold War state for, already 22 or 23 years. And I found it a bit eccentric for Joe Nye to dismiss the idea of the Cold War so quickly the other day in a piece I read. The second broad point, I think, is that, I mean, I very much agree with the, not talking about the Cold War in the singular. Your title is Narrating Cold Wars. And I think even in the original Cold War, it was never in the singular. There were at least 4 important Cold Wars going on: the United States, Soviet Union, the United States, China, the Soviet Union, China, and India, China at various times. I mean, sometimes they were all present almost at the same time, but not necessarily all of them. But over the span of those 50 years or so, I mean, 40 years, there were several Cold Wars, and that's true today as well. There's US-China, to my mind, US-Russia, India-China again, and perhaps China-Japan, as Japan becomes a more normal country. Again, I see, a kind of parallel there. But just 4 other very quick points about the parallelisms, I think. Obviously, I mean, the power distribution is a shadow over both these countries, as they were in amongst the 2 main contestants in the old Cold War, and seeking influence and so on is very apparent, even if they're not exactly seeking allies anymore. I mean, to some extent, although the economic relationship is different, to the extent that there's been talk of decoupling right now, that brings to mind, the old, certainly US-NATO attempt through COCOM to deny certain kinds of technologies and economic possibilities to the old Soviet Union. So again, I'm quite struck by certain kinds of parallelisms. So the power distribution is a shadow over it, the relationship, and there's influence seeking, and even some talk of kind of disintegration economically. Partnerships, I mean, of course, the US led a very formal alliance system, or several of them, but there's something like that going on even now, very clearly. I mean, sitting here in Southeast Asia, you can see Washington fairly desperately trying to shore up support here and partnerships here from countries that were sympathetic or allied ones who have drifted away, but they sort of want them back in the fold. And we had just recently Defense Secretary Austin, followed very quickly by Kamala Harris. AUKUS, of course, has just happened as well. So certainly sitting here in Singapore, it looks quite a lot like. And on the Chinese side, one might say, I mean, without being cynical altogether, that connectivity and so on, the BRI is a kind of, a quasi-alliance seeking, softening up countries on the periphery and even quite distant possible putative partners around the world. So I don't see it as all that different, to be honest. The third, I think, point relates to Ian and Maria's point about sort of ideology. Suppose we call it something different, which is differences in worldviews, which is a bit of a softer term. And I think there is something here that, again, is somewhat striking. The United States imagines and propagates a kind of liberal internationalism, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. But China, one might say, imagines and propagates it in its own way, perhaps more subtly, more suggestively, sometimes more, kind of with a little nudge and a wink, perhaps, a kind of neo-Confucianism based on, the legitimacy of an order based on competency, not so much democracy, openness, and so on. So I think, whereas the US liberal internationalism blends kind of economic and political liberalism and openness, you see in the Chinese case a sense that, political competency and étatisme are important factors. And I think this does divide the two. And there's a propaganda war more or less subtly going on both sides in propagating these values. And certainly in Southeast Asia, I mean, I think we feel that sometimes not so subtle propaganda going on. And the last point I would make, I think, is that, there were flashpoints in the Cold War. Berlin, the Straits clashes of the mid-1950s, or not clashes, but the tensions over it. And of course, Cuba, most famously, 1962. I mean, today, Taiwan is poised rather dangerously. There's the South China Sea. and the East China Sea with the Senkaku Daewoo problem. And of course, as Ian mentioned, the India-China border issue. And, the United States is a kind of quasi player or an expected player or participant in almost all of those flashpoints. So again, I think I see parallels. So to me, it kind of looks, tastes, and feels like a Cold War. And if it is, then let's just call it that. I think it is a quick and dirty guide to what's brewing and what's been brewing since 2000. And so, yeah, there are some differences, but it's a pretty useful, quick snapshot of where we are and how things might play out. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. We were a bit concerned because, a conference was going on, and then we heard that the Chinese and the Americans have done a deal in Scotland. So where is the Cold War? These guys are talking about saving the planet. But
just very quickly on that, let's not forget that the United States and Soviet Union did do things together, including arms control. So it's not as if they didn't address any global issues at that time.
Okay, let me then move on to the idea of, because all three of you actually have very important connection with whether it's like political communication, whether we call it soft power or propaganda or mass media. So starting with Ian, wearing your hat as a former New York Times correspondent and author, and now a policy person in the top think tanks in the world, what is the perception of China, if you think from the sort of media perspective, how it is represented? And is there a shift which sort of reminds you of the kind of Cold War framing of foreign policy issues that was the case, like pro-Soviet government would be mentioned routinely in media reports. That kind of not particularly subtle framing. Do you see that in both in media discourses in the United States, but also in policy? For example, the notion of sharp power, which came from a think tank in the United States, and within days it had become an accepted term. Everybody was using it, and it was associated with certain countries, in this case, China and Russia. So what is the perception that you see, in the media perception, really? Because you have the advantage of both being a formidable journalist and a policy person.
Yeah, I'm still working out the policy side of it. Sometimes feel a little bit lost because I think I'm not so good at giving advice and things like that. But I do notice, and I wrote a piece about this about 5 years ago or something for the New York Review of Books, that the way the media covers foreign countries, it doesn't always lead to the best understanding of foreign countries. And I think that I hate to use the term Western media because it's not only Western countries' media. This could also apply to Japan or to other countries. But basically, the media is set up to sniff out problems, and most journalists get their training at home writing about problems. And so when they go to a foreign country to work, they take that lens and apply it there, which is not necessarily wrong. If you're trying to look at what's going on in Xinjiang, it's going to be hard to have a happy news side to that story, right? But or Hong Kong. But I think sometimes that the effect is, and especially when dealing with a country like China, where many different things are going on at the same time, or any big country, that you get a steady diet of negative news, and there's almost never anything positive. Now you could say, okay, in the past year or two, it's hard to find positive news in China, but even almost anything, like the coverage of China using Chinese medicine to deal with the coronavirus. This was all viewed as either quackery or some covert, soft power push or something like that. And so there was no effort at all to understand why they would be using Chinese medicine, or if there's this effort to revive Chinese medicine. And and why this is very popular among Chinese people because they feel their roots are lost and da 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 da. You know, it's a complex story, but this is just shown as either a ha ha ha, they're using this quackery, or it's all part of the plot to, you know, push something on the rest of the world or to cover up the coronavirus responsibility and stuff like that. So I kind of feel that there is a lot of cynicism in how everything is viewed in China. And this has not been aided by the fact that China kicked out, 15 journalists from China. 15. So basically, the guts of the U.S. press corps was expelled last year. Although that was in response to the Trump administration doing something similar to Chinese. But I mean, it certainly doesn't make it easy to have nuanced stories when most of the correspondents are sitting in Taipei or Seoul. They don't even dare sit in Hong Kong anymore because they may get into trouble there. But I think there's a very negative picture of China. It's almost unremittingly negative. That there's sort of nothing at all positive. When you live in China and you talk to Chinese people, they don't feel that they're living in a totalitarian dictatorship. I mean, it doesn't feel like to most people this is Nazi Germany 2.0 or the Soviet Union 2.0. But this is kind of how it's portrayed. Overwhelmingly in the media. Okay, once in a while, like once a year, there'll be a positive story or something. People will then say, hey, we did a positive story last January or something. And it's not even and I guess my point is also that maybe the media is inherently not able to do this because the media is set up to find problems, but the effect on people is that is that there's a very, very negative view of China, of other countries too, but I think in the case of China, it's just especially pronounced. So,
Thank you. Maria, I want to now ask you about, your current project sounds fascinating, China's global soft power. And as we all know, China is spending a lot of money, other resources to promote its version of events to the world at large. But just imagine for a moment that the United States soft power was based on Voice of America, right? It won't be very effective, would it? It'll be seen as basically repeating what the US State Department wants the world to know. You could argue New York Times that too, but in a more sophisticated way. But that's, Ian might not agree, but that's a different discussion. So the question I wanted to ask you is, given your experience, especially in Global South, and you said you're working in Ethiopia currently and other parts of Africa, and that's one area of focus for the Chinese soft power projects. How effective is it, and how do you measure it? Because it's a very difficult thing to measure, right? You don't, do you see any potential for Chinese media to be more, I wouldn't say critical, but be more professional in a sense that it is not, for example, I'm here now in Hong Kong for 2-3 years, and I read China Daily every day. It is available freely in the university. And I'm desperate to find some kind of analysis, forget criticism, analysis. So how do you, what would you say to your readers in China that I've done work on soft power, but this is what you need to do?
Oh, that's a big question. Maybe I need 1 hour. No, kidding.
You got 5 minutes.
3 minutes, yeah, 5 minutes. So first of all, media effectiveness or measuring soft power. I think that's the first question. I think that's really, in my view, it's almost an impossible task to really measure the precise effects, because we can measure surveys of public opinion. That's the only way that soft power has been so far measured in terms of its effects. And Joseph Nye, who coined the term, he himself also, I think he set up his consultancy where they measure public opinion and they kind of see which countries are more successful in soft power. Oftentimes when we talk about soft power effects, which we're shown public opinion graphs and tables. But I think that that's not entirely effective for various reasons. I mean, first of all, public opinion surveys themselves are fraught with all kinds of issues. For example, depends on how you pose the question, you might get a very different answer. And also, of course, only people who are available to answer those questions will be answering or engaging in a survey. And for the most part, I think when you're engaging in a somewhat sensitive issue. I think China is becoming a sensitive issue in many countries. It's not just some kind of a neutral sort of actor. It's actually a pretty contentious issue to talk about. So when you talk about this publicly, and I think public opinion survey is seen as somehow administered by the government or by state agencies, nobody really wants to say something particularly critical in some parts of the world. Where I was looking in Ethiopia, for instance, public opinion surveys are very positive. But when you interview people on the ground, in person, when you have focus groups, when you have private conversations, a lot more critique comes out. So a lot more concerns, anxiety about China's influence in the country, but also China's influence in the world, their global vision, what they're doing in Africa. All those questions come out privately. So they don't come out publicly in a public opinion survey where they ask, do you like China? Do you think it's doing something good in your country? People often just click yes, positive response. So I think there is some discrepancy between public opinion surveys versus kind of more private expressions of concern. That's something that I found, overall to be very much an element of this, the facet of this research. But when it comes to Chinese soft power efficacy, or how do we think about this overall in Africa and in global south, I think there's several points. I mean, first of all, Chinese media, China Daily is kind of not known yet, as you said, for much analysis. It is very descriptive and oftentimes just positive stories that you see. I found the same thing analyzing China Daily in the context of Africa, and of course in the US as well. But I think Chinese media overall has been doing some innovative work, in particular by hiring local correspondents. There's been a lot of localization efforts, and CGTN in particular is primarily hiring some talented local correspondents and editors. And there's some recent studies that emerged that showcase that they have been covering some issues that Western media wouldn't cover, in part because of resources. They have a lot more resources to cover more unusual stories, hidden stories, interesting stories, as long as they're not directly intersecting with China stories. So it's not somehow critiquing Chinese influence. When you're covering Africa itself, there's a lot more, I think, room to cover and present different perspectives. But when it comes to China itself, or Chinese influence in Africa, the stories are still primarily very positive. So there's not a whole lot of critique or investigation of what China is doing on the continent. And I imagine the same thing applies to other parts of global south. I think that's an important distinction in terms of what this media is conveying. And I think that's also part of the issue in some ways, because all over the world, Chinese media is questioned for its legitimacy. To what extent is it really presenting a balanced view? And surveys conducted with journalists across Africa, editors, educators, and so forth, they also showcase some concerns with legitimacy. To what extent is it really a credible source? And journalists still tend to rely more on Western sources when it comes to global media coverage versus Chinese sources. So that suggests that there's still, an issue there, some doubt about legitimacy, and in part because the stories, again, about China in Africa are very positive. That just shows that there's no willingness to really investigate or get into critical narratives. And then in terms of other, I think, initiatives, I think media maybe is by far not the most effective initiative, soft power. I think the more effective ones are more directly, that allow you to directly experience China. So trainings and education, I think, are really, in my view, kind of the new frontier of soft power by China, because they allow for young people, but also officials, journalists to come to China and experience, to kind of be fully immersed in this mostly economic miracle. That's what they're mostly projecting. Of course, people still come out with critical views and, mixed, balanced views. It's not all kind of brainwashing by any means. But still, there is quite a bit of inspiration about what they've experienced, just because it's a striking sight, especially for someone who's never been there. The short, very organized trip can be quite striking and impressive. So that I think that's by far more effective than just media reports. So that's another point. And I think overall, there's also quite a few contradictions in Chinese soft power operations in Africa and beyond. I think the vision itself, this idea of shared prosperity, that's something that I started out my remarks with, this idea of kind of presenting some material benefits or creating opportunities for economic growth. It's an attractive vision, but at the same time, Chinese projects on the ground don't always present that vision, right? There's often accusations of corruption. There are all kinds of protests against some of these operations, and also just accusations that maybe this is an unfair practice, and there are immense loans, of course, that come with this prosperity. So it's nothing, none of it is free. None of it is somehow just given to you. You have to work for it. And over generations, one has to repay the loans. And that's something that I think is on people's minds, and that creates a certain contradiction. Is it really somehow empowerment, or is it also in part disempowerment? Is it short-term empowerment, long-term concern? I think that's one of the big questions. And also the other important point is scale versus quality. There's a huge scale of Chinese soft power engagement. Thousands of scholarships. If you compare it to the US, it's incomparable. There are 50,000 scholarships were pledged to African officials in 2018 alone. I think some of the American most esteemed fellowships, like Yali Fellowship for African leaders, they give maybe 700 spots. So it's a very, very different scale. But at the same time, the quality of experience, sometimes it's quite mixed. Again, critical reflections about to what extent there's real learning happening through these trainings and exchanges, or is it more about kind of seeing China showcase itself, right? Kind of just show off itself versus actually learning new skills, new practices. So there's a lot of, I think, frictions between this kind of scale of engagement versus quality of everything, whether it's products, projects, infrastructure, or media content, or trainings and educational exchanges. So thank you.
Thank you. Kanti, your latest book, I haven't read it yet. I'm very much looking forward to reading it, but I read a review of it. I think it was in China Report by Shiv Shankar Menon, who, as you know, is one of the most distinguished Indian expert on China, former ambassador there, and he's got so many other distinctions to his career. And he was critical of one aspect of your analysis, which was about the book is about India-China relations, and you were arguing in the book, according to the review, I haven't read the book, that Chinese soft power was more advanced, more effective than Indian soft power. So India it thinks itself to have a Bollywood and IT and diaspora, etc., etc. And that was not just Mr. Menon. I read in other places there was criticism of that particular point. So do you agree with what Maria was saying about the complexity of Chinese soft power project? Sitting where you are, in a very interesting place for studying China. And just beyond that, I would also like you to say a few words about this China-India dynamic, because they still share forums like BRICS. They are part of SCO. But they also have very serious problem on their border. And there is a kind of mini Cold War, actually part of it, hot war going on now. So if you could cover both these points, that'll be very helpful.
Yeah, I think the soft power thing is exactly right. I mean, I've done many sessions in India on the book, and invariably the Indian audience comes back with a little bit of a sense of resentment and annoyance over this point. But I think I've stuck to my view. Maria was talking about measurements of soft power. It is notoriously difficult to measure. And sometimes people are measuring resources, and sometimes they're measuring the effects of those resources on actually persuading people to look at a country favorably. So it's all getting a bit muddied up. But if you look at the Lowy Institute in Australia, they've got a pretty good set of measures. And going by that, China is certainly ahead of India. It's not ahead of the United States or perhaps even some European countries, but it's ahead of India. And this is proving difficult for Indians to accept. And partly that's because of a second issue, which is for a long time, India persuaded itself that its democracy, openness, liberalism, and so on was its calling card over China. But of course, the last few years have seen, kind of democratic backsliding by India, which in a sense is the ultimate compliment to the Chinese. In effect, it is to say that, the Indian system doesn't work and your system works. And again, I've made this point to Indian audiences, and, it hurts them to accept that point, but it seems to me pretty clear. And in fact, I think there's probably not very well known, but there are right-wing groups in India who very closely studying the Chinese Communist Party and the way in which its arteries seep into every aspect of Chinese life, right down to the most micrological level. And it's the fantasy of these right-wing groups to emulate that, And so on many scales, I mean, of course, there's Bollywood and all that, but there's a very vigorous Chinese film industry. There's Indian art, but Chinese art, today fetches prices far in excess of virtually any Indian artist, and so on and so forth. I mean, one could go on. I mean, I watch CGTN. There's no Indian television show that can match the production qualities. I mean, they're mostly in the private sector. The public sector doesn't have a global television show in essence, but none of India's private sector TV shows, global news shows can match CGTN for production qualities. And I would say even for the level of sobriety that's displayed. I mean, there may not be very vigorous critical debate, but at least those people who are brought on from all over the world are allowed to speak without being interrupted and shouted down and screamed at, which is the norm on Indian television news shows. So, I mean, these displays frankly, don't persuade me that India has the soft power advantage at all. It's quite the reverse. And on things like brand names and so on and so forth, we could go on forever. Can you name an Indian brand name apart from maybe Reliance and the Tatas or something? But all of us could name a dozen Chinese brand names right off the bat. Okay, so I mean, I think the book does address a soft power issue. I think it does hurt India's sense of self-esteem, but it's a problem, and it's only contributing to the asymmetry in power between the two, which is quite massive, especially economic. And the real importance of it is, I think, just as in the Cold War, the original contestants were very attentive to the power dynamics, so are India and China. But the real importance of this huge gap is that the Chinese, I think, ultimately don't see why they should concede anything to India, whether on the border or anywhere else very much, because they're so powerful. And the Indians feel they can't concede, because to concede would be defeat and would be seen as a surrender. And no Indian leader today could be seen as surrendering to China, even if that surrender is very small. So I think that's a really big problem. The power asymmetry translates into a kind of a lock-in of conflict without either side being able to make any concessions, however rational they may seem. I mean, on another part of the Cold War, I mean, I won't touch the border issue. That's another flashpoint. It's a parallel to the United States-China Cold War, let's say, the border problem, and now the maritime contest between India and China is also a kind of parallel to the flashpoints issue. Again, partnerships, I mean, or alliances. India and China have never been on the same side. China has been with the Soviet Union, it's been with the Russians, it's been with the Americans, and this quadrilateral of powers, or quartet of powers, India has sided with the Americans and sometimes with the Soviets, but it has never been with the Chinese. The only time they were strategic partners was during the Second World War, when British Indian troops fought alongside against the Japanese, as it were. But the one I wanted to focus on was, again, this difference in worldviews, I mean, I think in the India-China context, and I'll just end here, is that there's a kind of level of political, social, and cultural disdain on either side. It's not sort of ideology per se. That's very palpable. I mean, I think China sees India as a great pretender to great powerhood, and they're very kind of dismissive of India's pretensions. And as a very politically flawed country, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, said, when he was asked once, he said rather sniffily, "Oh yes, India has a democracy, it's a tribal democracy." And it sees, China sort of sees India's society as very socially polarized and stratified, caste and religion, and fatally divided by these things. And there's a kind of view of India as a slave nation, prone to invasions and subjugations over a long history. And India repays the compliment, or Indians do, as China is a bullying and imperialistic power. All its people are socially conformist, they're kind of robotic, and there's no color there. And actually China is culturally inferior to India, but it has a superiority complex. I mean, this stuff is out there in the social media. It's sometimes carefully couched in the media. It's at the elite level, I think, on both sides. Part of it is ignorance. Part of it is willful caricature and putting down each other. And there's lots of racism. Simon Shen in Hong Kong has documented, the kind of racism on social media that both sides have. So I think, India-China Cold War is quite palpable, and it's rather bad, even though there've been elements of cooperation. So let me just stop there. Okay, thank you.
We have just 8 minutes left, and there's a very interesting question that has come from my colleague, Professor Cherian George, and I want you three to just reflect on it. Assuming that we are not in favor of Cold Wars, what would a counter-Cold War narrative look like? And can such narratives save us? It is a conference topic, but let's have some reflections briefly, please, because we got only limited time. So who wants to go first? Is there a counter narrative?
Oh, I could try. I mean, I could just
go ahead.
Say something. So I have to be given points for going first.
Yes.
You guys should be able to think of something more intelligent to say. But I would. I would say though that tripartite way of looking at China is not unhelpful, because I think it is helpful to see it as a systemic rival, because it is clearly a closed society that is closing even further and implementing policies that do need condemnation, right? But it's also, it is a competitor, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a rival. So in that area of economic competition, it can be a fair competition and so on. And I think it needs to also have that element of cooperation and partnership. I think that's a great idea. It's just not being implemented too much. I think people are focusing too much on the first and the second point, especially the first point. And so there was this sort of face-saving statement at Glasgow that didn't really amount to too much between the United States and China on the environment. But that sort of thing could be done more. There could be more of that, and more efforts made in that regard, and more efforts that say, emphasizing fair competition economically, rather than seeing everything that China does as being the result of state capitalism, which is the way I think Americans increasingly see the entire Chinese system as rigged, as a game that you can't play, and which is of course not the experience of many companies that make a lot of money in China. But you know, and I think that way of looking at China, having a multiplicity of views, is not, there's nothing wrong with that. I know in the Twitter world and in debates and so on, it's always better just to have one clear line and just drill that home. It sounds better and no one can accuse you of inconsistency, but the world is complex. And I think embracing that complexity, wanting to have more academic exchanges with China, we should be encouraging that, sending more people to China, more students to China. I used to teach students at an academic exchange thing, American students, and they spent one semester in Italy and one semester in Beijing. And they always said Beijing was far more interesting, and they learned far more by going to China, for example. So we need to have more of that, push more of that. And that doesn't mean that we also don't call out Xinjiang and other things. There's no contradiction there. So I think that would be my way of looking at it.
Thank you. Maria?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ian about exchanges and about complexity, of course, and finding different, room for some different counter narratives, or just kind of more, I guess, embracing more ambiguity in this relationship. I think it's not attractive necessarily to easy solutions. And I know in the think tank world, they often want you to have the one liner, the one solution. And I spent last year at the think tank as well. And I found that there's pressure to kind of have one final thought that just kind of sums it all up. And there's a very clear cut way out or forward. And that's just not the reality of it, right? So I, as a scholar, I embrace the ambiguity in my research, and I want to highlight more subtle narratives that are taking place alongside with that Cold War kind of meta narrative that I think we're all discussing here. But at the same time, I'm concerned that even though it's good, it's beneficial to have more of these exchanges and more productive engagement with China, there's the room for that is kind of quite shrinking, right? So the space for that is shrinking, and especially on both sides. And if you engage in something more constructive, or if you present some more sort of gray zone ideas about what China is doing, you say, well, not everything is ideological competition, or maybe sharp power is not the most applicable term for everything that China is engaged in, and there is still some room for public diplomacy. The response is not always very favorable in Washington, from what I found. It's just that they don't really want to hear that story. And in China as well, it's much more extensive domestic nationalism as well, and a lot of questions about the United States are kind of leave little room for negotiation. So I think that's something that concerns me, and as someone who hasn't been in China now for 2 years with pandemic, I'm also just looking forward to the borders reopening, and hopefully this exchange is starting to take place again, so we can start to be in conversation in real life at universities, at think tanks, at the media outlets, everywhere. So I really hope we can find that space, but I think that space might not come from states. It might come kind of from other actors and sectors. I don't think governments themselves might kind of allow us for that space. I think we have to carve it out ourselves through our own networks. And that's something I hope to continue to do. But also I think in terms of just non-US perspective, I think if we look at the global South, or in my context, in the context of Ethiopia, I don't think that they're seeing this Cold War narrative as at all helpful. I think they see this more as a narrative of negotiation, kind of strategic negotiation between those two different countries, partners, and as well as many other players who are in the region. So for them, really Cold War is something they don't embrace as officials or as educators, as media outlets. They want to negotiate as much as possible to gain as many benefits from both sides. And I think that's something something that's going to continue? So in that sense, is it really, Cold War, or is it more about negotiation? Is it both? Can you have both at the same time? Possibly. But if you ask on the ground whether they want to embrace Cold War, or they want to align, or they want to select a model, there's a lot of anxiety about having to select or having to choose a model or one side or one worldview. They want to adapt different elements from both. I think that's something that's worth pointing out.
Final word to Professor Bajpai.
Yeah, I guess I would urge the third parties around the world, close to either side or fairly neutral, to be far more active. Back in the old Cold War days, there were countries like Yugoslavia and India and Egypt and others in the non-aligned movement. Non-alignment wasn't just, not being permanently in this alliance or that alliance, or being neutralist or hiding and trying to, just stay away from issues. It was also, an active stance of trying to bridge differences. And I think, countries in Asia and other parts of the world, governments, but also, influential thinkers and think tanks and so on and so forth, they can play a role in trying to bridge the differences and pointing out, where they're not so different, where they're both at fault, where they might cooperate much better. So I guess I would make that point, a kind of almost, the subalterns have to step forward and try and bridge differences between, these two very big magisterial powers. And I think just to take them down a peg or two now and then, but also to more positively to try and build positive bridges between them and show them that the polarities are perhaps not as big as they always think.
Thank you so much. On that very positive note, we should end this session. I want to thank Ian Johnson, Kanti Bajpai, and Maria Repnikova for being part of this very stimulating session. Before we end formally, I wanted to just also thank especially my esteemed colleague, Kenneth. This is how tired we are. And Jerry and George, who have been working tirelessly to make sure that this incredibly rich and diverse conference can be organized on Zoom. And the bunch of PhD students who are being, like, again, from 7 to 7, I think they're working, maybe no longer. It's like, in the US, in China, you used to have this, so Chinese student told me now they have 007. So you work all 7 days, no break at all. So we're not quite there yet, but these guys for the last 2 days have been working like 12 hours a day. So thank you for all the members of the supporting team. Last but not least, the conference isn't over yet. The best part is to come tomorrow when our PhD students are going to present their research. And at that stage in their life, they do some original research. We just interpret the world. They do the material on which we work. So that's going to be a very important day. And I hope you can join if you have time. So thanks again for being part of this, this conversation, and hope to see you in person before too long.